watching closely.
What's the secret, Max?
You just gotta find something you love to do and then do it for the rest of your life.
I don't want to be a product of my environment. I want my environment to be a product of me.
Hello, and welcome to The Establishing Shot, a podcast where we do deep dives into directors and their filmographies. I am your host, Eli Price, and we are here on episode 58 of the podcast, continuing, just about wrapping up our early Spielberg series covering his movies of the 70s and 80s, with his last movie of the 80s, which is Always. And so, yeah, we're wrapping that up. I'm excited. I'll do another little episode kind of wrapping up this first part of the series before we continue with Spielberg. So I think I was kind of questioning for a while if I was going to continue with Spielberg after this or do something else before I go back to him. But I think I'm just going to jump right into Hook after a bit. Maybe do some other episodes before that. But yeah, so we'll get a few of those episodes in before the end of the year. But yeah, we're covering Always today, and I have my trusty brother-in-law joining me again. I think this is your third episode.
This is my third episode.
Done one each series so far.
Well, no, technically both of the others were Wes Anderson.
That's true. You weren't in the Nolan series. So
yeah, it was just kind of in the middle of the Nolan series.
That's true.
Yeah.
Well, it's still third episode, so yeah. So glad to have you back for that. But yeah, we're covering, of course, Spielberg. If you want to hear more just about Chase, you can probably go back to, I think, Isle of Dogs was your probably bigger introduction.
Probably
because that was your first one, but so yeah, go back and listen to that. But since you've already been introduced in the past, why don't we just jump right into Spielberg, and you can share your earliest memories of Spielberg if you can recall.
This is a hard one to recall. Just kind of, I guess, growing up in the 90s, and also my dad really liking Spielberg as a director.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to pick out what my first memory with Spielberg is.
Yeah.
I think my biggest memory early on that I can really draw up is us getting the box set of Indiana Jones DVD, like some sort of, like collector's edition box set of Indiana Jones DVDs. And I don't even think that it was my first time seeing those. I had probably seen Last Crusade before that.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember those being under the TV in the little hutch, and always thinking that they were cool and pulling them out and watching them, every now and then. And,
yeah. I feel like Indiana Jones was a big first for most people. But yeah, do you have any other like big Spielberg memories of growing up? Maybe like the first time you realized like, oh, Steven Spielberg is a thing, or did you realize it back then?
I may have realized it back then, even, back when I was like 7-8 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, Steven Spielberg and, George Lucas and, a couple of others there, those were the kinds of names that, as a child, I was like, oh, I like these movies.
Yeah, that makes sense. Was like E.T. and Jurassic Park?
Oh,
probably. Yeah,
definitely.
Big part of growing up in the 90s was Jurassic Park.
So certainly.
Yes. E.T. kind of endured, though. I feel like E.T. was still a really big deal when I was young.
I definitely have memories of E.T. as a kid, and compounded by like memories of the E.T. ride at Universal.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I always liked when I was a teenager, the Jaws ride.
Yes, yeah, that was a fun one
at
too.
Universal. I would always like, kind of like class clown. I would like put my arm in my shirt, and when Jaws came up, I would be on that side of the boat going like, I lost my arm. Really terrible joke, but
do I remember right that they had the actual shark animatronic there at the ride?
They had, I think so. I don't see why they wouldn't have. Why waste it?
Sure, yeah, get some use out of it.
Yeah, I don't really know, to be honest, but it would make sense. But yeah, today we are not talking about any of those great movies. We're talking about Steven Spielberg's Always, just sneaking into the 1980s. And was this this was your first time watching, I'm assuming?
I had never heard of this before.
Yeah, me either. Until I started this series, I had never heard of the movie Always before. It's it's one of those things where it's like there's a reason sometimes that a movie within a big director's filmography is kind of like lost to memory and lost to time. But yeah, it is definitely a movie. I was surprised to see that it's rated a 3.0 on Letterboxd.
I was surprised to see that too.
Which is not a terrible rating, to be honest. It's like right on the cusp of a movie that I feel like on Letterboxd, once a movie drops below 3, I'm like, okay, it's probably not a good movie. But if it's like 3.1, 3.2, I'm like, okay, this is one that like maybe some people don't like, but like some people do. And so I'll try it out. And so, yeah.
I was looking through some Letterboxd reviews, and there's some defenders of this movie.
Hey, you know, I mean, it is what it is. I guess that we've already spoiled what we think about when we think about this movie. But yeah, before we really get into that, let's jump into kind of the beginnings of this movie. So Spielberg saw this movie called A Guy Named Joe when he was a boy on TV, living in Phoenix. It was a Guy Named Joe is a 1943 movie, 1946.
That's
something.
43
like that.
Sounds right.
43. I just pulled it up. It's a movie, 1943, directed by Victor Fleming, of course, famous director of things like The Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind. Yeah. So, a big director. And it starred Spencer Tracy as the character Pete and Irene Dunn as the character Dorinda. And so, yeah, it's, Spencer Tracy is a pretty big actor. I think Irene Dunn was too, at that time. But yeah, it was a pretty, I guess, well-received movie back then.
It seems to have been.
Yeah. And anyway, Spielberg sees that movie on TV, and it's basically follows the same sort of format as Always does. So the main difference being it's set in World War II. So it's not firefighting pilots, it's World War II pilots. And so, Pete dies not saving a friend, but he dies kind of taking out a aircraft carrier warship kind of thing. Kind of goes down as he is taking down that ship. And then it has more of like a heavenly kind of, clouds, a lot of, I guess they pumped in a lot of like smoke and whatnot for some cloudy looking scenes where it's like airman heaven or whatever.
Nice.
The like, I guess head angel god, like I guess this wouldn't be God. It's kind of like maybe head pilot angel character is like a general himself. So yeah, yeah, so it has a little bit of a different tone and feel to it. Um, but yeah, Spielberg sees this movie. His dad was a World War II pilot, so that's a connection point. And then also, you know, it kind of has this feel of like, we'll save that for later. A little bit forward in Spielberg's life, I did read that there's kind of a legend has it kind of thing where Spielberg apparently showed this as a teenager to a girlfriend at the time.
Okay.
And she did not like it, and he immediately broke up with her. So,
Well,
I'm assuming that Kate Capshaw likes a guy named Joe, and maybe, as we'll maybe get into, maybe Amy Irving didn't like a guy named
not.
Joe. But yeah, so another I guess a fun fact before we get more into the beginnings is Spielberg produced and apparently directed some of Poltergeist,
right.
which was directed by Tobe Hooper. And Spielberg suggested that Hooper put a clip of this in that movie, I guess, because at that point he wasn't necessarily like, it wasn't like a go for him to do his remake. So I guess he wanted to pay homage to it somehow. But he had them put a guy named Joe into Poltergeist, and it's like the parent. Have you seen Poltergeist before?
I haven't.
Yeah,
No.
it's definitely worth a watch. I think it's pretty good. So the parents are like in bed, and it's like the scene when Pete is like arriving in aviator heaven or whatever, and like seconds later in the movie, after they're like watching the scene, the like spirits like make themselves known in some way, and so yeah, that's how.
That's a good tie-in.
Yeah, I guess it is. Still, it's more like it makes more sense knowing that Spielberg really loved this movie, because otherwise, why aviator heaven to make the connection point of spirits? But hey, it is what it is. But yeah, so the idea of Spielberg remaking this movie actually started with he was talking with Richard Dreyfuss on the set of Jaws in 1974, and Dreyfuss loved the movie too. I guess they both kind of grew up loving it, and yeah, so they talked about doing a remake of it, and he had kind of sat on that idea for years, and I think really launched kind of the project of starting to work on it in 1980. And so 1980, he starts kind of getting some screenwriters to write versions of it, basically adapting the original. So the original was, directed, of course, by Victor Fleming, but it was written by Dalton Trumbo, who at some point in the 40s kind of got blacklisted.
Oh, okay.
Because of like Communist Party connections.
Like McCarthyism.
Yeah. And so so he was blacklisted from Hollywood. And he actually did, I think there were some movies that he had like writing credits on under a different name, basically. Like, or like under someone else. Like there was another person that was acting as the writer, but it was really Dalton Trumbo sort of thing.
Gotcha.
So I think it's because he was like actually a pretty good writer, but screenwriter, but obviously couldn't work in Hollywood. So everyone still wanted to use him
quietly.
Yeah. Yeah, basically. So yeah, so they're basically adapting, working to adapt Dalton Trumbo's script, basically.
Gotcha.
So I think he went through like a dozen or so screenwriters trying to get this remake script done. And one of those was Jerry Belson, who ended up being writing the final version, got the credit, screenwriting credit for the film. But yeah, I mean, almost 10 years working on this, as far as like trying to get a script and trying to get a cast together. So yeah, I mean, really something that he really wanted to do, apparently.
It seems that, it really seems that way, that this
Yeah.
was kind of a passion project.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, obviously, like, he loved a guy named Joe. It was a big part of his childhood, I guess. And hey, you know, when you're Steven Spielberg and you want to do a remake of a 1940s World War II ghost romance, I guess, you know.
I guess you get to do it.
Yeah, I guess you get to do it. And it's funny that, like, this movie didn't do all that great, but then the movie Ghost came out and did pretty well. I think shortly after, I think I heard somewhere that, like, this movie even, like, kind of was inspiration for the movie Ghost in a little, somewhat, I guess. Wow. So, yeah, I don't know how much truth there is to that, but hey, it could be. I don't remember when Ghost came out. Do you know when Ghost came out?
I do not.
Yeah. Oh, here it is. 1990. So, yeah. So they were probably being made right there close to each other. So I don't know how much it could have, like, influenced. I guess there was something in the air, though, since they're coming out one after the other. Something about ghost romances that people in the late 80s, early 90s were just, you know, itching for. Hi. Quick reminder that you, yes, you, can be a huge help to the production of this show. If you visit establishingshotpod.com/donate, you'll find out how to join the Establishing Shot family through some giving tiers starting as low as $5 a month. You heard that right, only $5 a month. And not only will you be helping me keep the show going, but you'll also get some perks yourself, like early and ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, access to a Discord server where we can chat it up about the show and movies in general, and more. Might even let you choose a movie for me to review for the show. Check out that link in the show notes to learn more. Back to the show. But yeah, so as they're remaking this, Spielberg made a point to not rewatch A Guy Named Joe because he didn't want it to, like, I guess, stunt his creativity in making this remake, which it makes sense. You want to, I guess, he's kind of like going off of his memory of it, like his nostalgia for it, and trying to, like, I guess, capture maybe that feeling of what he has in his memory of this movie, instead of, like, rewatching it and studying it and trying to, like, do what it did, sort of thing. I guess
that makes sense.
Yeah. But yeah, he did reject staying true to the original setting, which was, 1943, because he didn't want to lose younger audiences. Apparently he thought, like, the historical and emotional references, like, specific to that period weren't really relevant. And I kind of disagree with that. I feel like if he would have done that, it would have done just as well, probably.
Yeah, probably.
I don't know why. I don't know. I wasn't around for 19. I came around in the early 90s, so I wasn't around, especially not around enough to, like, know what was relevant and what would or not wouldn't connect with younger audiences. But I don't know, when I was young, I could connect with World War II films, so
I could too, but it was, I mean, it was a lot more recent back then. Maybe, he's even thinking of himself. Like you said, his dad was a World War II veteran. Maybe he's thinking of his own context and going like, oh yeah, movies about that time period don't really resonate with me. Why would they resonate with people younger than me? Yeah,
that could be. Yeah, I just thought that was odd personally. But yeah. So he was friends with Penny Marshall, who was a director. She directed Big, which Spielberg was connected to at one point. And then I think a couple years later, she directed A League of Their Own. So, but yeah, she had the idea to basically, like, transpose the setting to the, like, water bomber pilots, like the firefighting pilots, basically. And so, yeah, he took that idea and ran with it, and yeah, they that's the big I guess that's the big difference, is like the setting, and there's some other differences that we'll get into later when we're talking about maybe what doesn't work about the movie.
Sure.
But yeah, I think that's the biggest maybe difference, is the setting, and some of the problems are because of that difference, I think, which again we'll get into. But yeah, they do both end with the same like line and visuals of, you know, the kind of that's my girl, that's my boy walking into the sunset, Hollywood kind of traditional Hollywood ending kind of thing. So I guess that was like, I guess Spielberg was kind of paying homage to that Hollywood ending tradition with sticking to that same ending. So yeah, but yeah, one of the, you know, I wrote down too, like a couple of other things in the script that were like fairly different, that it took more liberties with. One was I feel like the kind of Pete Dorinda romance was more central in this remake than it was in the old movie.
It certainly is very central. I didn't get a chance to catch up with a guy named Joe.
Yeah.
But it's certainly very central in this.
Yes. And it's not that it's not a big part of a guy named Joe, but everything revolves around it in always. And in a guy named Joe, there's enough of like of separation of things where like everything doesn't hinge on that, I guess. And then, yeah, the other big thing would be it's obviously got a much more like, it keeps like trying to return to a more comedic tone throughout the movie. And the old movie had like kind of that typical, you know, 1940s movie like jokes every once in a while, but it wasn't like changing tone to a comedic tone when it was doing it. It was just like,
it never feels schlocky.
Yeah. It's just, well, I mean, yeah, not in the way that this movie does. This movie, like, it'll like completely switch back and forth, like whiplash tone between like kind of being like slapstick comedy to like drama romance. And the other one was just like, oh, that was a funny like one-liner in the middle of that scene sort of thing. Which was, I feel like it's typical of that time period in movies. But yeah, they did have to obviously get together a cast as well. Richard Dreyfuss plays obviously Pete Sandwich,
Yes.
which I think is a funny last name. It makes me want a sandwich.
I can see why.
Yeah. But Spielberg originally wanted Paul Newman and Robert Redford for Pete and Ted. So for the mentor-mentee kind of thing. And from what I gathered, they both wanted to play Pete. Like neither of them wanted to play Ted. And nothing I researched said that that's why they didn't ever sign on. It meant, like I've heard mention of that both of them wanted to play Pete. But I can only imagine that was the main reason neither of them maybe signed on, was they both wanted to play Pete. And if one of them had to play Ted, they were just like, nah, I'm good.
It's still a little funny that he didn't hire either of them for Pete.
Yeah. So, because of that, there must have been other reasons. Maybe they had other projects they would have rather done at the time, or, they could have like been like, oh yeah, I'll look at it and read the script and been like, no, not for me. But who knows? Who knows why it didn't work out? I feel like it would have been a very different movie.
It would have been.
With Paul Newman. I feel like it might have been pretty good with Paul Newman and Robert Redford.
Yeah.
Richard Dreyfuss is Richard Dreyfuss, but I feel like he's kind of on a way lower tier than Paul Newman and Robert Redford.
Yeah.
as a kind of an actor in general, I guess. But
Not that he's fine in
he's
them.
Richard Dreyfuss.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah, so Spielberg does end up going back to Dreyfuss, who, you know, he had originally, you know, started talking about it with back in 74. So I guess all along he kind of knew, like, well, I can always, I guess, ask Dreyfuss to do it if nobody else is going to do it for me. So yeah, this ended up being their like third and final team up between Jaws and Close Encounters, and then later on this. So two 70s movies and
a late 80s movie.
Yeah, very late 80s movie. So yeah. Holly Hunter plays Dorinda Durston, the romantic counterpart to Dreyfuss's Pete. And for a while, Deborah Winger was kind of first in line for this part. She's probably most popular for Terms of Endearment, which I haven't seen.
I haven't seen that either.
But she was actually in E.T. technically, uncredited. She was like an extra. I think it was like on Halloween. She was like dressed like a zombie and holding a dog, walking by the kids, you know, as they're going out to quote unquote trick or treat.
That's fun.
Yeah. So it's technically not her first Spielberg movie. It wouldn't have been her first Spielberg movie. And yeah, E.T. remained her only Spielberg movie. So there you go. They end up going with Holly Hunter. The thing about this movie is, with pretty much every other Spielberg movie I've researched, there was like a lot of readily available information, and with Always, it's been a little bit harder. And so, like, usually you'll have like, oh, Spielberg saw this person in here, he really liked their part here. And with this, there's just like, for like John Goodman and Holly Hunter, there's like none of that. It's the research is just like, oh, they wanted this person, but then Holly Hunter got the job. I'm like, what?
So I had found a little short series of press interviews.
Okay, yeah.
Holly Hunter specifically, he saw her in broadcast news.
Okay, well,
and,
yeah,
like,
everybody did.
Or he saw a rough cut of broadcast news and like immediately wrote her agent and was like, I want you for Dorinda, apparently.
Okay, well, there you go. So, which makes sense because she was nominated for broadcast news for her supporting role. That was 1987 movie by James Brooks. I have not seen Broadcast News. It's been on my list to see
for
a long time, and I just have not gotten around to it.
Always heard great things about it.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe I'll move that up my list to watch soon. But yeah, she did win like New York and LA Film Critics Awards too for her part in that movie. So, and then she did win for the lead role in The Piano in 1994. It's a Jane Campion movie. Very, very, very good movie. And what's funny is she's mute.
Oh,
yeah.
Well,
so Holly Hunter did not win for her typical Holly Hunter-ness. She won for a character that was mute, basically. So, yeah.
That sounds fascinating.
Yeah. It's a very, very good movie. That she's the lead in. So yeah. I would definitely check out The Piano, and pretty much anything Jane Campion does is pretty good. So, that's Holly Hunter. John Goodman, of course, plays, the best friend of Pete, Al Yaki, which all of these like last names, I didn't really even know until I looked at the cast list. But yeah, John Goodman, John Goodman was kind of just in a bunch of stuff. Like I feel like John Goodman never really got enough recognition for like his film work. I think he won some Emmys maybe.
I think you're right.
For his work. Like I would assume from like Roseanne, and maybe some other, I know he did some like stints on SNL, like hosting and stuff. Yeah, I feel like he just always plays really good supporting roles in movies.
Yeah, he's usually solid.
Yeah. And but yeah, he had just been in Raising Arizona with Holly Hunter. So it's like the connection point between them two.
They do have very good chemistry in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I guess unlike how I feel about Holly Hunter and Richard Dreyfuss, but hey,
Yeah. Or Holly Hunter and her other love interest, who I assume you're about
Brad
to talk
Johnson.
about.
Yeah. Brad Johnson plays Ted Baker. And so Ted Baker is like the mentee, obviously the young guy that Dreyfuss comes back to mentor as a aviator angel kind of thing, I guess.
Yeah.
And
the plot of this movie is, well, and I suppose it is for a guy named Joe too, but I guess it works there. But it's so strange.
It's strange in a guy named Joe too. Don't get me wrong. We'll get into it for sure. But yeah, so they I guess after Newman and Redford fell through, he really wanted Tom Cruise to play Ted Baker.
I could see that,
which would have been interesting. Yeah. I don't know how he would have worked with Richard Dreyfuss. That feels like it would have been weird. But but hey, he wanted it, but Tom Cruise turned the role down. And I feel like he made a good choice.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Brad Johnson was just kind of known as an ad model. I know he was like the Marlboro Man at one point. And yeah, good looking dude, ad model.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, which I think we have heard different stories about Brad Johnson spilling stuff.
I think we have.
I read a story where when Brad Johnson met Steven Spielberg, I can't remember where they met, but apparently he clumsily spilled some of his coffee on Spielberg, and this is like partly why he ended up getting the job for Ted. So yeah, what had you read?
So the story that I heard in his press interview,
Mm-hmm.
he talked about after his original audition, he gets called back for screen tests with Holly Hunter.
Sure.
And instead of the casting director, he was Kathleen Kennedy was over the screen tests.
Yeah.
So he kept calling her the casting director's name, which I've forgotten now, which is a shame. But both of their last names are Kennedy.
Gotcha.
So he kept calling
Laura Kennedy.
Laura Kennedy. Thank you.
Yeah.
He kept calling Kathleen Kennedy Laura, and he also had a full Dr. Pepper and spilled it all over her.
That's great.
I would love to think that both stories are true.
Hey,
because they make him very clumsy in this movie.
If one of them is true, then it's fairly likely that both are true.
Yes.
So, if you're clumsy, you're clumsy.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's great.
Which apparently he used to be a professional rodeo cowboy. That's not a good good profession to be clumsy in.
Maybe the weird clumsy balance maybe works when you're on a bull.
Maybe so.
So yeah, I did read that he was a rodeo fan, but I didn't read that he rode bulls himself. So yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, as Brad Johnson, he's in the movie. That's about all you can say for him.
Present accounted for.
Yes. A big star though, coming up next on the cast list is Audrey Hepburn, who plays the character of Hap. Apparently Spielberg had originally wanted Sean Connery to play the role, which in the original it is a guy that plays that sort of figure.
Yeah, you said he was a general.
Yeah, he was like a general, apparently somebody that they would have heard of because Pete acted like starstruck. He was like, he was a great pilot sort of thing. So I don't know if that character was based on a real person. I have no idea, but but yeah, he wanted Connery. Connery was unavailable. I don't know how he gets connected with. Did you see anything about?
I did not.
Yeah, I don't know how he gets Audrey Hepburn to come out of retirement. It feels like it's maybe one of those things where like he was like, I would love to work with Audrey Hepburn, and just maybe she heard about it and was like, yeah, I'd love to work with Spielberg, sort of thing.
Maybe so.
That's pretty typical in Hollywood when you have like a big star and like a big name director, and they're like, yeah, I would love to work with this person. A lot of times they work out something.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it seems like it was very not low effort in the sense of like her performance, but just in the sense of like the working environment as a whole. Apparently, they just flew her out to Montana for 2 weeks. She worked for 4 days.
Yeah, she was in Washington.
Oh, okay.
So and I think she was on set for a week or two in total. But yeah, even just a week or two of shooting is not that terrible.
No.
So
yeah,
but she was 60 at the time and pretty much retired. Like her last movie had been Peter Bogdanovich's They All Laughed, which I haven't seen that came out in 1981. So it had been eight years since she was in a movie. But yeah, she the cool thing is she was paid $1 million for her role, and she donated all of her pay to UNICEF. So all $1 million that she earned went to UNICEF. So I thought that was really cool.
That is really cool.
Yeah. A few other characters that I wanted to know, Marg or Marge. It doesn't have an E, so I'm not sure if it's Marg or Marge. But Marg Hellenberger plays the character Rachel, which we might talk a little bit about. She's kind of, I remember her being redheaded girl kind of like is flirting with Ted Baker in the movie.
She's like a mechanic or something.
Yeah, something like that. But yeah, that's that actress. Don't think she went on to do really anything else. Robert Blossom is in the movie. He is returning. He plays Dave, which I would not have remembered that this character was Dave, but the homeless guy that they run into.
Oh, okay.
Is Robert Blossom, and he's kind of
I kind of forgot that it happened.
Yeah. Yep. It's not that memorable. Anyways, Robert Blossom played the farmer in Close Encounters. That's kind of like out on the road waiting for the aliens to come by. And then he played a role as like a grandfather in the episode in one of Steven Spielberg's episodes of Amazing Stories that he directed.
Oh, okay.
Called Ghost Train, which is interesting. It's an interesting episode. So he's kind of a guy that Spielberg uses every once in a while. But yeah, Dave the homeless guy. Yeah, that scene was strange, much like a lot of the movie. And I don't really understand what the point of it was.
I guess it's just to like let him know that he can influence the world as a ghost.
Yeah.
But they could have found a different way to do that.
Yeah, it's weird. Anyways, Keith I did want to point out Keith David plays Powerhouse, one of the kind of other pilots in training. But yeah, Keith David, good actor. I've seen him. He's one of those kind of that guys,
just pops up in things.
Yeah, for sure. I can't think. It's one of those things where you can't think of it off the top of your head. But yeah, so he's in The Thing. He's in Requiem for a Dream. He's in Nope. He's in Mr. and Mrs. Smith. He's in American Fiction. He's voices things in Hercules and Princess and the Frog, Platoon, Armageddon. Just a bunch of random stuff. Kind of one of those guys you're like, oh yeah, that's that guy from that thing. The only other guy that pops up fairly often, I'm pretty sure it's this character Don, played by Dale Dye, who's like the air traffic controlman that Holly Hunter talks to a lot, kind of the older guy. I was like, I want to note that guy in here, but I'm like scrolling through the cast list. I'm like, I guess that's this guy. I don't know the character's name, and I think this guy kind of looks like him.
I think you're probably right.
So yeah, Del Dye plays Don, who's the only other kind of character of note that I can think of in the movie. So yeah, that's the cast. Of the crew, of course, Spielberg, Kathleen Kennedy, Frank Marshall produce it. The trio. We mentioned Jerry Belson, who wrote the final draft of the screenplay. There were some second unit directors. Frank Marshall did some of the Montana sequences, and then this guy named James Gavin did some aerial sequences in the movie as director. So that's pretty cool. The DP, the director of photography or cinematographer, whatever you want to call it, was Michael Solomon. I don't know. Mikael. There you go.
Yep.
Who worked with James Cameron on the movie The Abyss.
Oh, okay.
And which is a very good-looking movie. James Cameron recommended him to Spielberg, and Spielberg invited him to his place and met with him, and they actually sat down to watch The Abyss together. Spielberg obviously has a little theater at his house.
Sure.
At this point in his career, and they're watching The Abyss, and apparently 20 minutes in, he's like, "Okay, you got the job." So there you go. And this is a really good-looking movie.
It is.
It looks really good.
Yeah.
It's
him as the cinematographer, and who did you say directed the aerial sequences?
James Gavin.
They both did their jobs phenomenally.
Yes. And the how well this movie looks is probably my favorite thing about it. It's like the one thing that I'll brag on probably about it, the movie. But yeah, I just think it just really, really looks incredible. And you borrowed my Blu-ray.
I did.
And apparently, I had seen someone say the Blu-ray update just looks great. And I'd have to agree. I haven't seen it not in Blu-ray because I had never seen it before. But
I know you had said you had rented the DVD or not rented, but gotten the DVD from the library for the bonus features. But I guess that's all you really
I didn't watch it again or watch any of it on the DVD version. But
no commentary track.
No, there was no bonus features.
I don't blame them for that.
The bonus features was text, you scroll through text on the DVD menu was the bonus features. But it was something that you might see if there's a little booklet sometimes in a DVD, and there's someone wrote some production notes about the movie. That's basically all that all that was there for bonus features. When you have a movie Always, I guess you don't really invest that much money in putting together.
I guess not.
Special features. So there were some there. So these are some other guys, I guess, that we should note is there were some more directors of photography specifically for the aerial shots. Frank Holgate and Alexander Witt were those guys.
I applaud them.
Yeah, very well done. I don't often note the camera operator, but for some reason it was in my resource book that's kind of up here above my head. It noted the camera operator, so I guess we should give Paul Babin a shout out. Of course, so we have some big time Spielberg collabs in Michael Kahn as the editor.
Sure.
Edited most Spielberg things, the vast majority of his things. And then same thing for John Williams for the score, which is, I found that this was a really, really solid score.
Yeah.
1941, a lot of people liked the score and I didn't really care for it. But I feel John Williams just kind of, he either makes something super iconic or something that's just super solid.
This was solid.
It does its job.
Yeah.
So John Williams pumping out another 80s score for this one. Ben Burtt of Star Wars and Indiana Jones fame does the sound. And I think he did sound for Alien too. Yeah,
I thought I heard some X-Wing sound effects at one point.
X-Wing. I heard lights. I noted in my notes lightsaber sound.
That may be what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
I just I remember thinking, Star Wars sound.
That was it.
Yeah.
Was definitely. It's like it's during one of the plane sequences. Some like landing gear like comes out and like knocks something or like gets hit with something. There's something with the landing gear, and it makes this like I think it's the sound that like lightsabers make when they clash. It's like the
Yes, that was it. Yeah.
And the landing gear made that noise, and I was like, that was a lightsaber noise. I hadn't looked at the crew yet, but I was like, I bet Ben Burt did the sound for this movie. And sure enough, Ben Burt, there he is, Ben Burt. There are also some guys that are kind of they did some collaborations with Spielberg to doing the film sound editing effects. Richard Hems, who won an award with Ben Burt for Last Crusade. And he did some future movies with Spielberg too for sound. And then Gary Rydstrom also did some future work with Spielberg into the 90s and 2000s. James Bissell is returning from E.T. as the production designer.
Okay.
So I think it's pretty good production design, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Art direction, Christopher Burrian Moore, who apparently worked on some stuff in Amazing Stories. Richard Reynolds was another art director. He did some future set design for Spielberg. Richard Fernandez too. Ellen Mironic, I assume I'm pronouncing that right, was the costume designer. She had a pretty huge career. I was looking at her filmography, and she just did a ton of costume work. But she was, I did note she was nominated for Oppenheimer for a costume.
Oh, cool.
So she was the costume designer for Oppenheimer. Didn't win, but she was nominated. Michael Wood. Yeah, Michael, I was trying to see if there was an S on there. Michael Wood does the special effects supervision. He also worked on Jaws, Poltergeist, Twilight Zone. So he's kind of worked with Spielberg before for special effects. Visual effects is a guy named Bruce Nicholson, who had done a lot of visual effects work with Star Wars and Indiana Jones, I think Close Encounters. So probably an ILM guy, George Lucas's company, special effects company.
Right.
So, and then aerial sequence designer, a guy named Joe Johnston, who did a lot of like visual effects work for Star Wars, and I think he worked on Raiders too. So a lot of probably an ILM guy too. These, and then yeah, we did mention the casting by Laura Kennedy, who,
yes,
you know, it is what it is. The casting, so
it is.
Richard, I would say probably Richard Dreyfuss is the strangest casting, but I don't think that's her fault.
I don't think that's her fault either. Yeah, that seems to have been
like, I feel like Holly Hunter is she does pretty well with what she has to work with. Mm-hmm. John Goodman, same. I don't know how much of a decision she had made with Brad Johnson, so we'll lay that on her. That was her fault.
Sure. Yeah, Dreyfuss seems to have been Spielberg's call directly.
Yeah. That's, yeah, you know, hey, it was Dreyfuss loved the movie too.
Yeah, they were friends.
They got to do the remake together.
Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, that's the crew. Let's move into the production. So before we even get to the production, a year before productions kicks off, in 1988, there were these forest fires in Yellowstone National Park. It was like a big thing. Like you can just type in Yellowstone fires and it'll probably come up like the 1988 forest fires that went through Yellowstone. And they sent out 2 aircraft to like capture footage of those real forest fires, which are used in the movie.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So, you know, just kind of like, I guess the irony of, you know, death giving way to life in art, that happens, you know, at times for art. yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, you wish there wasn't a rampant forest fire in Yellowstone, but also they got their
might as well
footage.
take advantage of it while you have it.
Yeah, might as well use it. So yeah, it kicks off production in May of 1989. So they shot from May to August in 1989. So, and then August to December for the turnaround for post production. So they really I feel like this is something that's just different from back then to now, is movies take longer to get released now than they used to, because it's the same thing with like a lot of these like 80s movies that Spielberg did. Was it like he would shoot them in like the beginning part of the year, and then they would release in like the summer, or shoot them in the middle of the year and they would release in December. It's like, man,
that would never happen today.
No.
Which is a bit of a shame, but
yeah, it is. Yeah. Stuff gets caught in like production hell and ends up not as good as it should be because of that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they begin in Montana near Kootenai National Forest. This small town Libby, I think, was kind of one of the central spots. And Libby and some of the surrounding towns provided a lot of like the extras for the volunteer firefighters. And I think I read two different numbers. In one place I read over 150 people, and in another place I read 500, which is a pretty big difference.
That is.
I would, based on what I saw in the movie, 150 makes more sense. It doesn't look like there was ever 500 people. So, 150 extras from these like towns around Libby, Montana. And there was some sort of like remote airfield in Libby that James Bissell, the production designer, really liked the look of, and so they did. That's where they did all like the Montana airfield sequences, was at this like it was used, but the air traffic was like very infrequent, so they didn't really have a lot of like. They didn't have to worry a ton about like being interrupted, like the shooting from aircraft, like actual aircraft landing.
Yeah, they weren't inconveniencing anybody.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, the fire scenes were filmed on already burned land in Yellowstone.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, again, taking advantage of that. There's a water sequence in the opening scene and at the end, and those were shot at Bull Lake in Montana. So a lot of Montana shooting. And then they moved on to Washington State. So everything that was shot that was supposed to be set in that Colorado like airfield or whatever is actually in Washington State. It's at a World War II training base in Ephrata, Washington.
Okay.
And it's like it's kind of has a desert-like feel to the area, which another thing. Like James Bissell was like, oh, I like the contrast between like Montana and this more desert-like area. And so yeah,
and it is a good fit for like lowland parts of Colorado.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, and then that's I think the area in Washington was close to Spokane, because that's where they shot Hepburn's final shots, was somewhere around Spokane, Washington.
Okay.
And the outfit she wore was from her own wardrobe, which is really cool, I think.
That is.
And I read that the crew like would carry her around on a stretcher for like the 2 weeks that she was on set, so that her outfit could like stay really like pristine and nice, which makes sense for the character, because she's like, an angelic kind of character. You want her to look like pristine. And,
oh, sure.
But also like it's fitting because it's Audrey Hepburn. It's like, why not carry her around like a queen?
Absolutely.
So I loved that. and I love that it was her own like outfit. I think that's great. I've touched on a little bit production design stuff. I didn't run into a lot in my research. I did see that Spielberg did specifically request World War II planes for the film. This is a quote from Spielberg. He said, "I wanted the story to be somewhat timeless. A lot of the old World War II bomber pilots have kept their old airplanes, or at least restored, bought, and used parts and turned them into firefighting equipment. I thought that would give a timeless feeling. It's a contemporary movie. It feels like it's set in the 40s, but in fact, it is set today." And I think he's probably right there. It does feel like it's not set today, even though it is. Yeah, so I thought that was cool. He got those. These are like actual planes that they had turned, like that. A lot of these pilots had turned into firefighting planes.
That is really cool.
Yeah,
and it's a nice through line with a guy named Joe. I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. That connection point too. So a little bit of special effects stuff I found. Of course, the in-flight choreography by James Gavin that we talked about. He had worked in TV and film for like 25 years prior to this, and I guess just had a great name. And I think he did. The aerial sequences are really good.
Oh yeah. Did you read if that was like a specialization of his? Was like
no, yeah, I don't. I kind of looked I looked a little bit at his filmography, but it didn't look like, oh, he's doing a lot of plane stuff necessarily. And actually, I think he did a lot of like acting too. And he was a pilot in some of the things he acted in.
Oh, okay.
So he probably was a pilot himself, and
that would make sense.
Yeah. But yeah, so the other thing about these planes were they were really big and heavy, and so they can fly at lower speeds because of that, and which makes it easier to like hit your targets with the fire retardant. So that's, I guess, practical for real life and also for shooting a movie. I guess less takes you have to do when you can be more accurate. The other special effects thing I found in my research was about the creation of the forest fires. So the forest fires, obviously you don't really want to set fire to anything.
No.
Because it's not controllable. And you can't like control, not only can you not control the fire, but you can't control like if you can get a good camera angle to shoot it. So it's just, you just don't want to set a real fire. But Mike Wood, who was the special effects coordinator that I mentioned, with his expertise, they were able to like create these like their own trees basically that would like light on fire on cue. And so what I read didn't go into exactly how that worked. But there's a lot of like, so for instance, in Last Crusade, when they were in the room that was on fire, Ford and Connery, there were basically like these pipes that had, gas running through them, and they would light it, and then, you can turn the gas off and it would go out.
Right.
And so it's probably something similar with the trees that they've made. Obviously they didn't use any trees that were still alive, but yeah. And then I did one of the co-producers, Dick Vane, he had given credit to the U.S. Forest Service and local representatives for, their, basically like their cooperation, like helped with them doing this successfully, obviously. But yeah, I don't have as much research on this movie as I usually do. It's just, I don't know. It's just hard to find a whole lot. I wish I had more info on like what they used for like the aerial shots. I just like didn't really find a whole lot. Like how do they mount the cameras? Like what sort of things were they doing as far as that goes? And I just don't know.
That's a shame, because that's the parts of the movie that I would love to know about.
Yeah. I know they did some work on the like Universal and Lorimar Studios lots. So some of it might be, you know, projection stuff in studio.
Sure.
I would guess most of the stuff where they're like getting close-ups inside of plane cockpits is probably like in a studio with like projection behind them or something.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
Speaking of like the studio work, one thing that that Spielberg mentioned in one of those press interviews was a lot of the soundstage work they were able to do on the same soundstage that Guy Named Joe had been shot on.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. That is really cool. So yeah, another little connection there. As far as like camera work, I just didn't find anything. I wish I had. It's obviously like you've got a lot of like typical Spielberg looking shots and that sort of thing. But yeah, I wish I would have found more information about that, because that was the part of the movie, like you said, that is actually like really good. Would have been cool to see more about how they made that happen. But hey, it is what it is.
Yeah.
It's the movie Always that most people have never heard of. So, but yeah, the movie was released in the U.S. December 22nd, 1989. So, like I said, just squeaking in.
Mm-hmm.
And this was 5 months after The Last Crusade. So, Last Crusade had come out in the summer, and 5 months later, you get Always. So,
yeah,
there you go. I did read that the budget was right around 30 million, I guess. And it did make a worldwide box office of 74 million. So
hey,
not really
made its money back.
A financial flop. So, yeah, I mean, it's got Spielberg, it's got Dreyfuss and Holly Hunter and John Goodman.
Yeah, John Goodman was one of the.
You can get people in seats with that.
Yeah, he was huge at the time.
Yeah. The reception was obviously pretty divided critically. Some people kind of saw it as like having a simple charm to it, which I guess I kind of get. It didn't work that way for me, but I guess I can understand that viewpoint.
Sure.
That's kind of how I felt about watching A Guy Named Joe. That felt to me like it had kind of a simple charm. This didn't have that same feeling for me, but hey, others focused in on his inability to like dramatize love stories or like build any sort of sexual tension. And I definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
Roger Ebert himself wrote this, quote, "This is Spielberg's weakest film since 1941, unquote." And he doesn't mean the year 1941. He means the movie. The movie 1941. But yeah, I'd have to agree with Ebert there as well. Yeah, a lot of reviews kind of talked about how it's like stuck between old-fashioned writing and kind of trying to create a contemporary fairy tale. And I kind of get that too.
I can definitely see that.
It's like it never really gets a full grasp on the fantasy aspect of the movie, I think. And you're like being pulled between these kind of more, it's like true to life, like fire sequences, and then like back to like these weird kind of overbaked romance sequences, and then like, I guess like dream weird heaven in a wheat field sequences. You know?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's being thrown you around all over the place. Obviously it didn't really get any awards. It did get a couple of Saturn Award nominations for writing and best fantasy.
Oh,
which I don't understand. Saturn Awards are like, it's basically like the Academy Awards for like genre films. It started off as being like horror and fantasy focused, and sci-fi, I think, but I think they recognize now like other like genre stuff too. Yeah, I don't really know. Yeah.
Nominated for writing.
You know, I don't get it, but hey, it didn't get actual like Oscar nominations. So, yeah, that's really all I have as far as that part of our talk goes. But
somehow I don't think this was the '89 movie that Amblin was pushing for awards.
Yeah, it's definitely a quaint little film with Harrison Ford and Sean Connery, probably.
Probably.
But hello again. Do you know how you can really support the show for free in just a few minutes or less? That's right. Just leave a rating and review on Spotify and Apple, or wherever you listen that might allow for ratings and reviews. These really help the visibility of the podcast. In fact, just hit that pause button right now and drop the review right now. And then you can get back to the show. I'd greatly appreciate it. Okay. I trust that you went and left that rating and review now. Back to the show. Yeah, let's move into some just like key points of discussion around the movie.
Okay.
The first being connections with Spielberg's like personal life, which I think we can dig into this. So you can like, there's not really much to dig into here other than just like raising the question of like, did Spielberg originally connect with this movie as a child because like he saw like a breaking up or a distancing happening between his parents? It's like, maybe. But all you can really do is like raise that question. You can't really answer it. But the big thing that was happening while he was making this movie was his relationship with Amy Irving was kind of deteriorating. They had married in, I can't remember now. It wasn't that long ago. At this point, it was maybe several years ago. I do know that he had his first child, Max, when they were starting to shoot The Color Purple, which came out in 1985. So yeah, probably about 4 to 5 years they had been married at this point. They basically, like, as you can imagine, it's Amy Irving, for one, like, isn't used to like the grandiose lifestyle, I guess, isn't really her thing. And it, like, Spielberg was living this like grand lifestyle.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, she's an actress, and it's kind of this thing where like Spielberg doesn't necessarily like want to cast her in a bunch of his movies because like getting like accused of nepotism.
Sure.
But then like other directors don't want to like cast her in their movies because it's like, well, we don't want to like mess with Spielberg's wife. So like she wasn't getting a lot of work. She wasn't like really, I guess they weren't happy with the way the relationship was going. And so, yeah, that's kind of going on during the production of this movie. And then as production is ending in August of '89, they announced their divorce. So there wasn't anything like disclosed about it, but if you just assume like, oh, she got half of his worth, she probably walked away with like $100 million at that time.
Yeah.
So yeah, which, it seems like, so they were very like, it seemed like they were pretty cordial, at least publicly. Like they, it's known that they made arrangements to like make sure one of them was always with Max, their son, if the other was like away working. And so, I don't think there was any like super like ill will between. It didn't seem like that sort of divorce. But I don't know. It could have been. Who knows? But then, yeah, so all of that, and then like in A Guy Named Joe, Pete learns that, life goes on if you lose a loved one, and the dead live on, in the memories of their nearest and dearest. And so, relating that to divorce, it's kind of like this picture of divorce not being like the end, but like the next stepping stone to like the land of memory, I guess. Like your love lives on and you move on, I guess.
Sure.
And so that could be something rattling around inside of Spielberg as he's making this movie. And that's kind of like the reason why this movie is the way it is, I guess.
Maybe.
So yeah, another movie that is controversial as far as like its reception would be Temple of Doom. And that was Spielberg and Lucas's breakup movie. They both had like big breakups.
Yeah.
Spielberg with a girlfriend and Lucas with divorce, as they were making Temple of Doom. So,
right.
So this is, I guess, Spielberg's second breakup movie, I guess you could say. But yeah. Did you have any thoughts on that?
One kind of personal connection thing that he mentions in an interview is like as far as the supernatural stuff in the movie goes, he mentions a memory he has of a dream he had as a kid shortly after his grandfather died, where his grandfather like comes into the room and is like looking down at him in the bed. And yeah,
that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which feels like very Spielberg as a kid.
Yeah.
To have that as a memory. So that's probably, that's maybe a reason why he likes the idea of that.
Maybe so.
Of this sort of thing happening. He did, I did have a quote from him somewhere. Let me find it. He wrote, this is something that Spielberg said describing the movie. He said, "It's a story of life and love and how love connects even after someone is gone. It's a romance that spans two worlds, one present and one ever present. There's something about the idea that someone could be just over your shoulder getting through to you, even though you can't see or hear him." And I guess like, I kind of get that, but at the same time, I'm like, that was still kind of weird. But it's
not sure that he's making that point as well as he thinks he is. In this one,
he's so sentimental, and so like with that in mind, I guess you have to interpret that through the lens of like Spielberg's extreme sentimentalism. So yeah, and in that way, like I kind of understand it, but yeah, just the way he talks about it in that quote it's still strange to me,
Sure.
But yeah, another thing is there's just, early on in the series, I talked about how Spielberg has often said that, especially like early on, his movies were kind of like his therapy. He was always like working out stuff that was inside of him in his movies. And you see a lot of that, and stuff like Jaws and Close Encounters and like a lot of his early stuff. And I think some of that is coming out here, just like anxieties about death and like the ending of one part of your life and the beginning of another, like transition times, is definitely like, there's a lot of like working through those sort of like life circumstances in this movie, just with a weird premise around it. And then I did read that when he was promoting the movie, he was like pretty elusive about all that personal stuff.
I can't say obviously I blame him for wanting to talk about his personal life,
as he probably should, but he claimed that like he really just wanted to tell a story about inspiration and like inner voices that guide artists creatively. And that's, to me, that sounds like, oh, well, that's very personal too. It makes the film all the more personal knowing like he thought about it from that angle as well. Because, Spielberg does talk about like his influences of like movies that came before him, movies that he loved as a child. Like that's a big deal for Spielberg. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Let's talk about problems with the film, and then we'll end on maybe more maybe some more positive. Let's try to like do some. Let's try to do a sandwich of positive, negative, positive.
Okay.
I guess we didn't really have a whole lot of positive, so it'll just be negative, and then we'll try to end with more positive.
I think we can do that.
So yeah, let's kind of go through some problems with the film. The first being that I mentioned earlier, kind of the disconnect of the original movie and this movie. Where does that disconnect come from? Because they're mostly this very similar plot wise. The setting is very different, obviously. And then like we talked about like maybe the romance is more prominent in Always. It flips tones to comedic more often. But I wanted to read, try to dissect a little bit more why the old movie was maybe more successful than this. And I wrote down this quote from critic Pauline Kael. She said, quote, Spielberg has caught the surface mechanics of 40s movies, but he seems to have no grasp of how they worked, of the simplicity that made them affecting. He starts out with too much danger in one episode after another, and he overcooks everything in a fast, stressful style. All he seems to want to do in each scene is get an audience reaction. And I kind of think that's one of the big problems is like in every scene you can feel like Spielberg really, really like trying to wring out something, some reaction in you. And that can work for some people, honestly. Some people like are affected by directors that like are really like trying to like get something out of you. That is just like not something that works with me. And Spielberg is a very sentimental director, and he does like wear emotions on the sleeves of his movies often. E.T. is like that, but E.T. is very affecting to me, and this just isn't. And I almost wonder if like the setting is a big part of that. Like, so obviously like forest fires are dangerous.
Sure.
Volunteer firefighting is like honorable, but it's just not the same as a pilot in World War II.
No, it's not.
The danger and the self-sacrifice just doesn't ring the same, and it doesn't have the same like effect on you as like an American viewer, or like it's just not the same. And I feel like the stakes never feel up to par with what Spielberg's trying to do in the movie.
I agree.
And I feel like it's not like it's done like extremely well in A Guy Named Joe, in my opinion, but the setting helps a ton.
You can almost, I can imagine that you could almost take it for granted in that one. Whereas here it needs to feel earned, and it's not feeling earned.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I just, there's also this kind of like, I'm trying to, Spencer Tracy in the original, who plays Pete. He's kind of like, he's got this like old movie charm to him that Richard Dreyfuss just does not have. Dreyfuss just does not have charm.
No.
He has more like jerk quality to him.
Sure.
And like that plays really well in some movies. Like in Jaws, I love Richard Dreyfuss. Like he's kind of a like cocky jerk in Jaws, but it like it really works well in the dynamic of those three main dudes.
Right.
And here, like a lot of times you're just like, man, that guy's a jerk.
Yeah. You're like, man, why are they friends with him?
Yeah. And then like, so like in Pete and A Guy Named Joe, like there's a very early sequence where like he's walking and these kids like call him over and they're like wanting to hear about like flying and all this. And it's like this really like very early in the movie thing where like you kind of see a side of Pete that's like very endearing and sweet, and like these children love him and he loves these children, and they kind of have this secret where he tells them about like flying and being a war pilot, and they like, don't tell anyone that he told them, about it, sort of thing. And
Sure.
it's, it's cute and fun. And like that sort of thing is absent in this movie. Like you don't have, and that's maybe another thing that is a problem, is like the character development. It's like very uncharacteristically bad character development, in my opinion, for the most part. For Pete especially, I think.
Yes.
It's super hard to like grasp his motivations as a character, like why he's doing the things he's doing, why he's not doing something like saying I love you. Like I never really understood, like, why can't this dude just tell her he loves her?
Right. Especially like if they're at the point in their relationship where they're ready to move across the country with each other,
Yeah,
and like start their lives over together. Why isn't he saying, like, why isn't he expressing his emotions to her?
Yeah. And then like he's like, there's the scene where he's gotten the offer to move to Flat Rock, Colorado, and be an instructor and get out of the air and the danger. And like she's trying to convince him to do it. He's like very adamant that. And up to this point, you understand, like you've kind of like learned that this is who he is. If he's not this, then he loses his identity, sort of thing. And he's very adamant that he's not moving. And that all kind of adds up. And then all of a sudden he's just like, okay, I'll go, basically. And you're like, wait, what? There's like no like development to get there. Like,
right.
And so it's just hard to like figure out who he is and why he makes the decisions he makes. It's rough with him. And then like I wrote down the weirdness of the dynamic of this main trio in a contemporary film is just weird. The main trio, not Al. I mean like Pete, Dorinda, and Ted.
Right.
I wrote down another Pauline Kael quote. She said, quote, "Now that Spielberg is no longer 12, hasn't he noticed that there's a voyeuristic queasiness in the idea of playing Cupid to the girl you loved and lost and fixing her up with the next guy?" In 1943, it was the finality of death that was being repressed. What the new age hell is being repressed now? Unquote. I love Pauline Kael.
That's great.
Yeah, I don't always agree with Pauline Kael's takes, but I always love her writing, even if I disagree with it. She was a great critic. But yeah, I think in the original too, the romance was definitely a part of the movie, but it wasn't like the main focus. It really was like she's right. The finality of death and having to like move on and that sort of thing, and wanting your loved ones to move on was like a big part of that, and that makes sense in the war context. And here it's like, what is he trying to like? What's the point he's trying to make? Like, it doesn't make sense in this context. It's not the 1940s anymore. It's the 1980s.
Right.
And this weird like dynamic going on, this voyeuristic Cupid thing is like, doesn't make any sense. It's weird. It doesn't feel modern.
No,
and then on top of that, like the romance doesn't even really work that well
with either of them.
Yeah. I will say this. It started off okay. Like you kind of get this like kind of like you get that they kind of like to push each other, and like there are some relationships that people have that are like that. Like you know, you're stuck in your ways, I'm stuck in my ways. We're gonna like tease each other about that, but we love each other. And I kind of like was trying to get on that kind of wavelength with them at the beginning of the movie.
Yeah.
And that like all gets thrown out the window when there's the weird dance sequence with like all the guys. Like, I mean, Richard Dreyfuss is literally like holding towels, be like, wash your hands before you dance with my lady. Yeah, like, what in the world is happening? Like, why? It's 1989. Like, why? And that's not in the original. Like, it's not like it's paying homage to the original. It's just like a really stupid joke that doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't.
Like, it's
most of the humor just landed completely flat for me with this.
Yes, it's funnier that they thought it would be funny than it actually was funnier in the movie. Yeah. It's just Dreyfuss's tone is just way off. Yeah, I wrote down this. This is a quote from Molly Haskell, whose her book is I'm listening to on audiobook, one of my resources. She said, quote, "The romance is not romantic. Hunter is scrappy, funny, argumentative, and pure tomboy, more like a playmate or a sister. Even her professional ambition has a wistful, "aw shucks, I'm just a girl" quality." And then like the dress transformation kind of like emphasizes that, all of that. And it kind of, I didn't make the connection of, it feels very much like Karen Allen in Raiders, like putting the dress on, and then it's like this, like, oh, you know, like I really am a girl kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know. I was wondering, like, okay, would Holly Hunter and Richard Dreyfuss work in a rom-com? Like, maybe. I could maybe see that more working, but it just doesn't work here. I don't know. And yeah, and then like going along with what Haskell was saying about the more like playmate or sister, when there's like the dancing scene later on in the movie where it's like cutting between her dancing alone and him dancing with her kind of thing. Like when he leaves that, he says like, "Sleep tight, sister." And it just feels, the whole, like that scene kind of feels like you're connecting with something, but it's not romance. It's more of like a familial.
Did he say that, or did Dave Ted say that in his like John Wayne voice, doing the I
thought
True Grit bit?
Maybe they both did.
Maybe so.
I think they both did.
Okay.
But
where'd I get Dave from? Anyhow.
Yeah. Dave, Ted, you know, who cares? But yeah, I think that, I guess saying like "sleep tight, sister" kind of emphasized though how that has a very like familial tone to it more than a romantic tone. And maybe that's why like it is a bit more affecting, because that's something Spielberg does really well, is like that familial sentimentalism.
Yes.
And romantic stuff he just doesn't do well. So yeah. Hello there, listener. Don't you ever want more for your life? Don't you ever dream of surpassing the status of just podcast listener? Well, I've got good news. If you head on over to establishingshotpod.com and click the send a voicemail button on the right side of your screen, you can be featured on the podcast. I'd love to hear from you, whether it's a comment in response to an episode you liked, an opinion of mine you disagreed with, or just a question for me. And if you're too shy to have your voice featured, you can always email me at establishingshotpod@gmail.com. Don't settle for just being a podcast listener. Reach for the stars and get featured on The Establishing Shot. Back to the show. Yeah, the tone in this movie is just another reason it doesn't work. It's just all over the place. You know, is it comedy? Is it drama? Is it fantasy? I don't know. He like dips his toes in like the supernatural spiritualness, but doesn't like really fully commit to it.
Right. But even with the supernatural bits taken out, this movie doesn't feel grounded in reality at all. Apart from the really intense fire scenes.
Yeah.
everything else that's like in the real world part of the movie,
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like something you could ever experience. Like, people aren't like that.
Yes. Yeah, and it's there's a lot along those lines. There's a lot of like dumb shticks. Like there's like Pete like ghost pranking Al all the time, and I'm like, what is that? What is going on here? And then there's like another shtick that like emphasizes how much of a jerk he is, which is like when he's first becoming Ghost, and he like tells that guy like he's silly looking or whatever, and like then the guy's just like looks at himself in the mirror and gets all sad. I'm like, dude, what a jerk. Like, you're using your ghost powers to like ridicule people. Like, I don't get it. And it's not like he grew from being a jerk ghost to like a nice ghost. It's just
and Audrey Hepburn like originally is like, oh yeah, you're such a good guy, that's why we brought you back.
And you're like,
no, he's not.
I mean, he sacrificed himself he was a good friend, I guess.
Sure.
But, like, he's a jerk. He's a jerk who can't even tell his like girlfriend that he loves her without a plane roaring where she can't hear him, you know?
Right.
Which happens at one point in the movie. Yeah, I don't know. I almost wonder if his nostalgia for the original just like blinded him to being able to like remake this in a way that made sense. That made more sense in like a modern context. Because if you're going to move it out of the 40s and you're going to make it in a modern setting, then you need to like contemporize it fully. And I don't think he did that. I think his nostalgia maybe for the original kind of like held him back from contemporizing it to the 1980s in like fully, not just in setting, but like
in tone. And
the only thing that I feel like he made 80s about it was like shticky comedy, but it was just like thrown in randomly throughout the movie. So that doesn't work either, because it's like tone whiplash. It was a similar thing in The Color Purple. In The Color Purple, there's like these random like shticky like dumb comedy scenes that like don't work at all with the tone of the movie. It's like you don't need that in that movie. It's one of the things that I really hated about I felt like there was a few scenes that were just like ruined by that in The Color Purple that could have been so much better.
That's true.
Let's go down to the characters for a second so we can still end on a better note. We've talked about Pete. I guess like to round out our talk on Pete, his like weird possessiveness over Dorinda is like one of the main things that I was like, they should have modernized this, because this does not read well in 1989, and it definitely like maybe it read better in 1989 than it does today.
Yeah,
but
now
today,
it's just jarring.
It's just like, this dude is Creepster McGee. Like, like there's the lines like, "Don't forget you're still my girl," is just like does not read well.
No.
In 2024. I don't know how it felt in 1989. It is I'll say this, it's a line from the original. In the original movie he says that to her when he's a ghost. But in the original they can't, it's not set up the same as in this one. In the original, like they can't see or hear you at all. In this one, it's like, oh, they can hear you if you like are talking directly to them, and it's like it's their own thoughts. In the old one, it's just more of a feeling that he was able to make go through the ether, I guess, from the supernatural to the natural. I don't know.
Is the tone the same? Because that line could almost be sweet in a different tone.
It's one thing, it's one thing that I do dislike about the original is it's what's jarring about the original is like I said, it sets him up to be a really good guy unlike this new one. And he's like super nice. He's really endearing. He like very obviously loves Dorinda in the original. And then when he becomes a ghost, it's like he's more angry and more like, and I guess that could make sense of like, yeah, you're dead and you're having to watch like your girlfriend fall in love with this new guy. Sure. And like I could get how like you could be angry, but it is a bit jarring. Like there is definitely a difference between him before dying and after dying of like you never get the sense that he would have talked to her that way in real life before he dies. And so that is a little strange in the original even too. But not in the same way that it is here. Here it's like it just feels creepy.
It does.
It's like, dude, like you do not own this woman. Yeah, I don't know. And it's hard to connect with like the emotion at the end. Like they end with the same line, like that's my girl and that's my boy. And then it reads weird. To be honest, like it reads weird in the original, watching the original in 2024. It read even weirder in the 1989 remake.
You never get the feeling that he likes Ted in this.
No. In the original, you do.
Okay.
You do. There's a lot more time spent. So a lot of the time spent in always with like focusing on the romance and focusing on the after death dynamic of, Pete and Dorinda. There's a lot basically like shave off half of that and put it of like him spending time with Ted and like not liking Ted and Ted being like, this young guy that like doesn't have like kind of sucks. And then like, he's like, it spends a lot of time with them in the plane together and him like yelling at him. But then like when he starts to do good, he's like encouraging and he gives him lines to help him pick up girls. And, and like you also see like how good of a guy Ted is. There's a scene that sets him up as like, he helps out a fellow guy that's like homesick. He like goes to a phone booth and apparently like figures out his parents, like figured out his name and calls and asks for, his parents or whatever. And, says, oh, I'll call for so-and-so on the phone. And he goes over there and it's his mom. It's like, oh, that was a sweet thing to do for this guy that's homesick, So like it sets up even Ted to be like this really nice, good guy, similar to how it set Pete up to be this really nice guy.
Gotcha.
And so there's just a lot more development of that relationship in the original. And so like it makes more sense for him to say like, that's my boy in the original.
Yeah.
And this one, it doesn't.
Yeah. In this one, it feels like, Audrey Hepburn has sent him back to help this kid out, and he's just completely ignoring
torture him.
Yeah.
That's what it feels like, to torture Pete.
And also just that he's just like neglecting that duty to go try and have resolution.
Right.
Yeah.
And he does. That's all it seems like he's doing, is trying to like get away from Ted so that he can go like have his own resolution with Dorinda or see what she's up to. And the original one just isn't like that at all. In the original, he's only around Dorinda when Ted is around Dorinda, other than that kind of final flight. Is the only time that they're alone together in the original that I can think. No, that's not true. There's a few times, but it's he doesn't like linger like he does in the remake. And so it's strange. It's weird. I don't get it. Dorinda, Holly Hunter as Dorinda is like the only other thing in the movie that I'm like, not so terrible.
Yeah,
she's basically like acting circles around everyone else in the movie.
Oh, absolutely.
Maybe other than John Goodman. John Goodman's fine.
John Goodman's fine, but he's given really silly things to do the whole time. It's not his fault.
It's not. He's doing very well at being John Goodman with what he's given.
Yeah. But yeah, Holly Hunter is actually giving a pretty good performance.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. And like every time she's with Richard Dreyfuss, she's like acting circles around him. Same thing with Ted.
Oh yeah.
With Brad Johnson as Ted. And I feel like there's something. So Spielberg is very good at longing. The feeling of longing Spielberg is great at. And in the scenes before like she gets connected with Ted and Pete shows back up in her life, those like kind of like middle scenes where she's alone, she like it really sells that loneliness and that longing for what you've lost sort of thing.
She does.
Man, it's good. It's good acting. You feel what she's trying to portray. It's very affecting. And yeah, it's like the only other thing in the movie that I'm like, this movie looks really good and Holly Hunter's pretty good in it. So, that's about it.
Yeah.
That's yeah. So yeah, I don't know. I liked Holly Hunter. I'll say that. I did like Holly Hunter in the movie.
I did too.
Ted is so bland of a character. He's not given much to work with, to be fair.
He's not. He is the real thing that's not working in this movie. Is they're just not. He has no character.
No, he has no character. There's no development. Like he's. I wrote yet again another Pauline Kael quote. Quote, one moment Brad Johnson is the goofus who can't follow orders. The next, he's the top flying ace. There's nothing in between.
Yep.
This guy is a real find. You look at him and you want to know, does he sing? Unquote. That was kind of like a parenthetical there at the end. She was like, you do wish this guy could sing and be in a musical because he looks great.
Yeah.
But yeah, he has no character. I feel like he has one good scene. It's when they're in the car and he's like doing the John Wayne impression. At like the first time he does that, I was like, okay, like this guy's not too bad. But then like, I don't know, as the movie goes on, I'm like, this is just not working.
No. And it seems like the only character development they're giving him is like Ted influencing or Pete influencing him to be more like Pete. Yeah. And it seems like the only reason John Goodman and Holly Hunter are liking him is because he's acting like Pete.
Right.
So you kind of wonder, okay, well, Pete's ghost is gone at the end of the movie.
What's going to happen if he's not Pete anymore?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other big thing that I really was like, okay, if I'm like rewriting this in my head as I'm watching it, how do you modernize this? It's like you don't have him end up with Dorinda.
No.
You have him end up with Rachel, who feels like his age, who is like into him. You have Pete.
They really set it up that way too. And then they just like, drop her character completely.
It's actually like a really good meet cute moment. Like she's like really into him. He's kind of like off in, nowhere land. And you're like, okay, like that's a funny like thing. She's like into him and trying to flirt and he's like not getting it. It's like, okay, that's a fun meet cute kind of moment. But like, it doesn't go, she just like drops off, like you said, drops off the face of the earth. Like
she really does.
Maybe see her once again the whole rest of the movie. So after that scene in the bar.
There's the scene in the bar. There's the next scene where he's like trying to fly back in.
Yeah.
And she's taxing, or she's not taxing. The taxi has
some of its own. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, after that, I don't think you ever see her again.
Yeah. But yeah, in my head, I'm thinking like, okay, the rewrite of this that like puts it in a modern context is not like super creepy. Like Ted thinks he loves Dorinda. Pete helps him to see like, no, you really, this is the girl for you. She's really into you. y'all had actually like pretty good chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
Like, don't let this pass you by. Don't not tell her I love you when you have the chance,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and helps him like do with Rachel what he like didn't do with Dorinda. And then maybe having like the Dorinda character like see this work out and her maybe mentoring Rachel, like, and helping her to like not take for granted what she has with Ted. And like, that's how Dorinda is able to like move on. Because like, one of my problems is like, why does Dorinda need Ted to release her? Like,
Right.
that's very like, from like unfeminist for one thing. And like, I don't know, it just feels creepy and weird. It's like, you don't own her. Like, you don't have to like, you don't get to release her. That's up to her.
Right. Also, you don't get to tell her how to grieve.
Right. Yeah. And in my head, I'm like, okay, but like, if he's able to like give Ted, because that's what he's supposed to be being sent back to do, is to mentor Ted. If he's able to give Ted what he wasn't able to have, and Dorinda helps Rachel have what she can't have anymore, and that helps her move on, then it like takes away that creepy element. And like, yeah, you have some like interactions with Pete and Dorinda, like them longing for each other, and not him being dead and her, yeah, you can have those scenes in there, but you rework in a dynamic that makes much more sense for a modern context, where they're both able to move on at the end.
Right.
And there's not like that weird possessive quality to it. And so, yeah, if Spielberg's listening and he wants to give another go at it, I'll help him with a new script for the 2020s. That'll make more sense. But yeah. Yeah, at the end of the day, I'm just like really not sure what this movie is trying to like say or do. Like, we talked a little bit about those personal elements, and maybe those are working into it somehow. But yeah, do you have like any sense of what the point of this movie is? Maybe what it's trying to say? I wrote down some quotes. Did you have something?
Sure. I think it is about loss and like trying to learn how to like move on.
Yeah. Yeah. If I think it's about anything, it's probably that.
Yeah.
Does it communicate that well?
No.
I did write down a couple of quotes that I'm like, okay, maybe these quotes have something to do with what this movie's trying to do. The first is a quote from Hap. She says, anything you do for yourself now, like for yourself, talking to Pete, anything you do for yourself now is a waste of spirit. And I was like, okay, like, is that saying something about, doing things for others, making that the focus of your life? I don't know, maybe. But he's dead. It's like, it almost gives you the sense of like, well, you can do stuff for yourself when you're alive, but once you're dead, like,
what's the point?
Yeah, what's the point? And then there's this other quote from Pete when he's talking to Dorinda. He says, the love we hold back is the only pain that follows us here. And that makes sense for what we were talking about. Like, move on, like the loss and the moving on, not taking for granted what you have when you're alive. Like, don't hold back any of your love. Let it all out while you still can. Because that's the only pain that can follow you to the afterlife, is any love that you held back. Like, okay, that makes sense. Like, I can get on board with that, and I can kind of see that through all the weirdness and all the creepiness.
Sure.
Yeah. So that's in there. Yeah. That's about all I've got to be. So yeah, let's end all this on a better note.
Okay.
Spielberg distinctives. Was there anything that stood out as like, oh, that's so Spielberg when you were watching the movie? Not necessarily.
Like the shot framing and everything.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. That's probably the main thing for me too, is just like, I mean, you've got silhouettes.
Lots of silhouettes.
Lots of silhouettes. The one that stood out to me was when they're it's like nighttime and Pete and Dorinda are like, I guess there's like some mechanics working on some planes out kind of, I think it's like his plane out in the distance, the bright lights, and they're like watching. I was like, oh, that's a really cool shot. There's the fantasy and real world overlapping. I think is kind of a Spielberg distinctive. Something that he kind of infuses in a lot of his movies. Even the Indiana Jones movies are very much like real world and fantasy overlap movies. The color purple is something that like didn't necessarily work extremely well for me, but it has that kind of feel at times even.
Okay.
E.T. obviously.
Sure. Close
Encounters obviously. It even like to a certain degree Jaws, because of like the nature of this like manic shark and how like fantasy like creature feature kind of that feels sci-fi even almost. It feels at times. So yeah. And then like the other like technical thing would be like close-ups and people stepping into frame into close-ups is something that I've noticed Spielberg just does really, really well, and it always looks really good. The picture I have from this one is like, it's like a pointed up shot and like John Goodman steps into the frame.
I remember that one too. That was a good shot.
It is. It's a great shot. And Spielberg does it. And every time he does it, I'm like, like it's the same shot he does in every movie, but I love it every time. So
lots of like lighting contrast, like using warm light and like blue light to contrast with each other.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's definitely in there. And then the other thing is the other thing I would say that's maybe a negative is that when he leans too much into comedy, it just doesn't work. That was the big problem with 1941. That was the problem with parts of Color Purple. It was trying to like lean in, force comedy. And when it's just like you rely on the charisma of your actor, like Harrison Ford or other people in like the Indiana Jones movies, the comedy in there works because it's not like forced. You're just like letting the charisma of your actors come through and say the funny one-liner. You know,
right.
It's not the focus of the movie. You're not trying to force it. And the comedy here just feels forced. And it kind of emphasizes that unfortunate distinctive of Spielberg, which is that when he really tries to force the comedy, it just doesn't work. But if he just lets it happen naturally, like it usually works. His movies can be funny, but not when he forces it.
Yeah.
And it feels very forced. Part of that is Dreyfuss, I think, in this movie. But the script is very obviously trying to get a lot of laughs.
Yeah.
And
John Goodman sticking a straw in a Twinkie. And
yeah, I didn't laugh a lot in this movie.
No.
I'll say that. It was more like eye rolling. And then I guess our last thing we can talk about before we kind of start wrapping up is any like intriguing sequences or shots. Obviously, beautiful plane sequences.
Oh, yes.
Just beautiful. Were there any that stood out to you that you can think of?
The whole sequence of him saving John Goodman is incredible.
Yes.
Coming
up out of the cloud and looks great.
The ending sequence is pretty well done. Like her Holly Hunter's character, Dorinda's stubbornly, going out and taking on the fire herself and all that. That's really well done.
Yeah. And this is like going back to something we said before, but that could definitely be like that. Just like that was the main time they were together in the original, that could have been their main time together in my rewrite. And then both like, him kind of talking through like how he's seeing how she's moving on, mentoring Rachel, and how he's been having the same experience moving on, mentoring, Ted, and realizing that. And it could have been the same thing. Like, it could have been the same, like, really good. Yeah. Anyways.
That opening sequence too. The first 15 minutes of this movie,
Oh, yeah.
I was really liking the first 15 minutes of the movie.
Yeah.
The whole sequence with him running out of gas and having to try and make it back to the airfield, and yeah, it's great.
Yeah, it really is. It really is good. It's, in hindsight, it's weird that it opened with like a gag, which is like the dude's jumping out of the boat.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that's trying to say or anything, other than maybe
it looks cool.
It does look cool, but all it really communicates is like, yeah, Pete's a little bit of a jerk.
Yeah. Yeah, because you can obviously see these dudes in the boat. Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, it looks really great. And yeah, like I said, the movie really worked for me. I was trying to get on board with it until like the sequence where all the dudes dance with her, which just dragged on and was weird and just threw me off. I was like, oh, what is going on here? What is this movie? Yeah. So I will say this. So the dancing sequence later on, where it's like edited together with like her dancing by herself and like showing him like at certain angles, it's just like her dancing by herself, but Pete's there in spirit form and like he's kind of dancing with her in some shots, and it's like edited together and like honestly like is really well done. It looks really good. And like even you feel something with it. But like because of everything that surrounds it, like you don't know what to do with that emotion because it hasn't like earned it in the right way, and it doesn't like close it in the right way. So it's just like an unfortunate, like really, really, really great sequence that's just like put in the middle of junk. That like, yeah, just unfortunate. But there's moments of brilliance like that even in this movie. It's like even bad Spielberg movies are still like have enough in them that are like, okay, like this is better than a lot of really actually bad stuff.
Oh, sure. This isn't a horrible movie.
Yeah. It's
just really disappointing for Spielberg.
Very, yeah. And I did write down to another like really great shot or just like sequences, like I think you mentioned it too, was them in the plane at the end. The way it's composed is just like really great, really great stuff. And I wrote down, in my notes while I was watching, there's a shot where like, I think it's, a reflection of him in the instrument panel or of her. I can't remember which one of them it is, but there's like, it's basically composed where you see one of them and the other one is like reflected in one of the like glass of the instrument panel. Yeah. And it just like, I was like, that's really great. That's really great. Like Spielberg thinking up a cool shot. Yeah. And then like after she like saves the firefighters, there's the shot of like the plane flying across the stars is just like beautiful.
It is.
That might be my favorite plane shot of the whole movie. And like the most Spielberg-y plane shot. Yeah, loved that. But yeah, that's really all I've got on this. I don't know. Did you have any other thoughts on, did you have any final thoughts on Always? It's okay if you don't.
I don't guess I do. What a way for Audrey Hepburn to end her career.
That is a final thought. That's a good final thought. I'm sure she had a great time shooting it. She looks great in the movie.
She does.
I don't really have a big problem with her character.
She's
just being like beautiful, like Audrey Hepburn, and delivering lines with like grace and ease.
Yes.
That maybe aren't like great in the context of the movie, but that's not her fault. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good final thought. I wrote down my final thought is transitions can be rough because the transition in the movie is really rough. And also like this transition in Spielberg's career is a little rough. He's been having a tough go at it. The 80s are like oftentimes talked about as like the great Spielberg decade, but like it's really like you've got 3 Indiana Jones movies, which are great.
Sure.
And you've got E.T., phenomenal. And then it's just like a bunch of like, was this good or was it not? I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a bunch of that. The Color Purple and, his kind of like the Twilight Zone movie
mm-hmm.
and the Empire of the Sun and this movie. It's kind of like, was this movie good or was it not? It's really like he had Indiana Jones, which is like half George Lucas.
Right.
And then E.T. was like phenomenal. And it's like, I don't know, maybe it wasn't his strongest decade.
I think I would probably put the 90s above it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
maybe the 70s too.
We'll get to the 90s. Yeah. The 90s starts off still kind of in this rough transition with Hook, I think.
That's fair.
And
I do like Hook more than this.
Yeah, I haven't seen Hook since I was a kid, so I'm interested to rewatch it.
To be fair, I haven't seen it in at least a decade.
Yeah,
the nostalgia might be doing some work there, but
sure,
it's
and that's fine.
Oh, sure,
yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. It's just kind of transitions are rough. Spielberg is in this awkward transition in both his like personal and professional lives.
Mm-hmm.
He hasn't had a lot of success with these movies in the mid to late 80s. Not as much as like you would think he would have, sort of, other than Last Crusade, which did really well. Everything else is kind of like, well, that didn't do as well as I thought it was going to do, both like awards wise, financially. Mm-hmm. And so, he's in this like rough, like, what do I do? Do I lean into what got me here in like movies like E.T.? Do I try to do more serious movies? Those haven't seemed to work out partly because like he can't let go of the E.T.-ness of him and fully commit to the seriousness, which you can see in this movie too. Like he couldn't fully commit to the seriousness yet. And then like his relationship with Amy Irving breaking down, obviously that's a transition. He's working through, like, he's in a period where he's kind of learned that his dad wasn't the main reason for his parents' divorce, that it was his mom. So he's working like on reconciling with his father, which you can kind of see come out in Last Crusade and Hook in this transition period.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So there's just a lot of transition going on in Spielberg's life. And it can be rough. And this movie is rough.
Sure.
It's just one of those things where it's like, in hindsight, you can see that, hey, that was rough, but you got through it and you got some great stuff coming.
Yes.
Because we do know there's some really good stuff coming. So, that was kind of my final thought. Transitions can be rough, which this movie is a prime example of in both content and just like the behind the scenes stuff.
So
that was my final thought on Always. Did you give this movie a rating?
I did. I gave it 2 stars on Letterboxd, so I guess like a 4 out of 10.
Yeah, 4 out of 10. I gave it a 2, and I almost wanted to give it a 3-star just because of how great it looks, but I was like, I don't know, I can't. So I ended up bumping it to 2.5. I gave it 2.5 stars for Holly Hunter and how wonderful it looks. So
that's fair.
Yeah. And really, like, I wish I could have given it more, because it really does. It's like, it might be one of the best looking movies even of his career up to this point. So
it'd be an interesting exercise to just put this movie on mute
Yeah, just watch it.
Don't put on subtitles and just look at it.
I don't know. Those sticks would still look real dumb.
Maybe pull up the John Williams score on like Spotify or something and listen to it in the background.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe that would work. Yeah, this was his only work with Michael Solomon as his DP, which he starts using. I'm blanking on the future collaboration that he starts. I think on at least on Schindler's List with. I just can't think of. I can't think of that guy, the DP's name, but I'm pulling it up as I'm vamping, and I'm going to say it any second. Janusz Kaminski,
Gotcha.
is his future cinematographer that does a lot of his stuff. So yeah, so it wasn't so bad that we didn't get more Michael Solomon, but man, I don't know. This movie looks really great.
It does. I might have to look and see just what else he's shot.
Yeah, he's done it. It honestly isn't. It isn't that impressive of a career. I was looking at it earlier.
That's a shame.
Yeah, he did The Abyss, which we talked about,
right?
And then like
That's a great 1-2 punch.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. A bit. What year did that come out? Both in '89. Both came out in '89. So great year for Michael Solomon. Arachnophobia the next year, which also had Frank Marshall directed. Also had John Goodman. Never seen it. Ron Howard's Backdraft in '91. Never seen that. But Fire, there's fire in it.
Okay.
So there's some firefighters. So there you go. Maybe Ron Howard saw Always and was like, "Hey, this guy shot fire and firefighters really well."
Yeah.
Another Ron Howard movie, Far and Away.
There you go.
Seen it? Yeah, those are really only the ones of note. Unfortunate. Because this movie looks great.
It does.
And yeah, I don't know. Maybe Michael Solomon only had a little bit to do with that. So, but yeah. So basically, 2.5 stars for how it looks, and Holly Hunter because she was great.
She was.
Yeah, this is one of my least favorite Spielberg movies. I have 30 ranked. On Letterboxd, and it is number 28, only above his really, really, really low budget TV movie Something Evil and 1941.
Gotcha.
Which I did not like one bit. And you can go back and listen to that episode to hear about that. So
I do think this is my lowest rated one.
Yeah, that's fair because you haven't seen 1941, have you? Right. Or Something Evil.
Sure.
Yeah, there's probably like some people would probably rate like Savage as another TV movie. Some people might rate below this. Some people might rate Twilight Zone movie below this. I could see some other movies being rated below this for some people, but yeah, for me it's number 28 out of 30. I've got a lot of Spielbergs to go to fill in. I'll keep filling in blind spots as I move on. So I'm excited to do that. But yeah, that's really all we have for this week. Next week, we are going to be wrapping up August with a fall movie preview, kind of looking at what's coming out the rest of the year, what I'm kind of excited to see, what movies we should put on, have on our radar to go see when they come out. So that's going to be next week, and then the week after that, we'll do. My wife actually had an idea. I was like, "What do I call it?" Because it's not. I've been calling it like an epilogue, because it's the end of the filmography, or at least at the time, the end of the filmography. But this is not the end of a filmography. So do I call it an interlude, or? She was like, "Oh, you should call it an intermission because it's like a movie." Yeah. I was like, "Oh, that's a great idea. It's a Spielberg intermission." So that'll be the week after that. And I was thinking about doing like kind of giving some best of awards to like some performances and direction and special effect. Maybe like give some awards for this first section, the 70s and 80s. What was the best parts of Spielberg in this group of movies. So
That's a fun idea.
yeah, so I think I'll do that for that. I haven't done that for any of my previous series, so this will be a first. But yeah, that'll be fun. So yeah, that'll be in a couple weeks, a little Spielberg intermission before we get into the movies of the 90s and start the next section of his career, I guess, which will be like the 90s and 2000s, is his kind of mid-career Spielberg, I guess is what that series will be called. But yeah, that's all we have for this week. Chase, you're, I know the main thing you would say for people to follow you on Letterboxd, just to see what you rate things, I guess.
Sure, yeah.
And I know you have a good bit of lists on there too.
I do have a good bit of lists. I write reviews every now and then.
Right. Yeah. So are you at Tables on there or something else?
Probably.
I'll put the link in the episode description.
That works.
Yeah. So Chase Abels.
Yes.
You could probably find him just searching his name.
Probably.
Or you can click the link in the episode description, which I'll put in the notes there. So yeah, follow Chase on Letterboxd. Letterboxd is always fun. But yeah, that's all we have this week. We will never cover Always again. And I'm good with that. I don't know that I'll ever watch this movie again or think about it.
I will either.
I think I won't think about it anymore after this. So yeah, goodbye to Always. And that is all we have for this week. So I've been Eli Price for Chase Abels. You've been listening to The Establishing Shot, and we will see you next time.
We were happy here. For a little while.
But look, I figure it this way. Better to be king for a night than schmuck for a lifetime.